If you're new to AskReddit cheating drama, make sure to subscribe and like the video. It only takes a few seconds, but it really motivates us to create more crazy cheating stories. Now, let's get into the story. My name is Claire. I'm 34 years old, and I design spaces for a living: homes, offices, restaurants. Places meant to feel warm, alive, like someone truly lives there. It's funny, in a cruel kind of way, how I've become so good at creating beauty and harmony on the outside, while my own life feels like a room slowly emptying itself out. I've been married to Nathan for 5 years. On paper, we're perfect. He's a successful CFO at a tech firm, smart, dependable, respected. We live in a two-bedroom apartment on the north side of Chicago, the kind with big windows and clean lines, everything in its right place. We host dinner parties sometimes. Our families think we're doing great. Our friends joke that we're the stable couple. But behind the closed door of our bedroom, we sleep like strangers, shoulders turned away, breathing out of sync. It wasn't always like this. We used to laugh more. We used to talk about everything and nothing until 2 in the morning. There was a time when his touch felt electric, when just the sound of his keys in the door made my heart beat a little faster. I used to feel like I belonged somewhere, like I belonged to someone. Now I don't really know what I feel anymore. Numb, maybe, or tired. Nathan is always working. His eyes are always on a screen, his mind on meetings and deadlines and quarterly projections. He comes home later than he used to. Sometimes he eats dinner, sometimes he doesn't. We talk, but it's about groceries, bills, his schedule. Nothing real, nothing vulnerable. It's like we forgot how to touch each other with words. I'm not unhappy, exactly. I'm just not happy either. I exist somewhere in between. And then one Thursday evening, everything shifted, quietly, subtly, like the first hairline crack in a wine glass. That was the night I saw Julian again. It happened at an art exhibition downtown. A client of mine was launching his first solo show, and I went out of politeness more than anything else. It was a cold evening in late October, the kind where the wind slips through your coat no matter how tightly you pull it shut. I almost didn't go. I had a headache. Nathan had canceled dinner again. I thought maybe I'd just crawl into bed and call it a night. But something, boredom, restlessness, a quiet ache I couldn't name, pushed me out the door. The gallery was small, tucked between a wine bar and a bookstore, the kind of place that smells like paint and possibility. I remember walking in, my heels echoing softly against the concrete floor, and the first thing I noticed wasn't the art. It was him, Julian. He stood with his back to me at first, talking to a small group near the center of the room. But I recognized him instantly. That posture, the way he leaned in when someone spoke, as if he actually cared about their words. He hadn't changed much. Still tall, still a little undone, like he'd thrown himself together at the last minute and somehow made it work. There was a streak of gray at his temples now. It suited him. I froze. It had been almost 10 years. We hadn't spoken since the end. A messy, unfinished end. No big fight, no closure, just distance and silence, and two people growing in opposite directions. I thought I'd buried him. Not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Julian had been intense. Our love was the kind that burned too hot, too fast. The kind that left marks you didn't notice until much later. He loved like he photographed, always chasing the light, always framing things just right, even when they were broken. I was still staring when he turned, and then our eyes met. Time didn't stop. It didn't shatter. But something inside me shifted, subtle and deep, like the pull of a tide you don't see until it's already around your ankles. He smiled. That impalpium crooked smile that once made me forget how to breathe. Claire, he said, as if my name was a memory he'd been carrying in his pocket all these years. I smiled back. Julian, just like that. Like no time had passed at all. We didn't talk long that night, just enough to skim the surface. How he'd been living in Portland for the past few years, showing in small galleries, traveling for inspiration. He asked about me too, and I gave him the polite version. Still in Chicago, married, designing spaces for other people's dreams. The air between us was warm and awkward, filled with words left unsaid and the invisible weight of what we used to be. Before I left, he handed me his card. If you ever want to catch up, he said. I told myself I wouldn't. And then I did. A few days later, I emailed him. It felt harmless. Just a quick hello, a thank you for the conversation. He replied within the hour. We started exchanging notes, longer each time, full of soft confessions and small details. What he was reading, what music I listened to when I worked, the way autumn always made him feel like the world was about to exhale. It was easy. Too easy. One afternoon, we met for coffee at a quiet little spot near the lake. It was a gray day, all mist and silence, and I remember thinking how familiar it felt being with him. Like slipping into an old sweater you forgot you loved. We talked for hours about our lives now, but also about the people we used to be. I told him I sometimes missed the version of myself that existed in my 20s, wild, uncertain, passionate. He told me he never really stopped thinking about me, even after everything. There was no flirting, not yet. But there was something else, a current, a quiet undercurrent tugging at us, pulling from someplace deeper than memory. That night, I came home to Nathan already asleep on the couch, a spreadsheet open on his laptop. I stood there for a while, watching him breathe, listening to the hum of our refrigerator, the kind of silence that fills a house when two people stop reaching for each other. And I thought, when was the last time someone really looked at me? The truth hit me harder than I expected. I missed being seen, not just noticed, but felt. It started small. A message here, a late night email there, a photo Julian sent me of a sculpture he was working on, raw, beautiful. Something about it felt like a question I hadn't yet learned how to answer. I told myself we were just reconnecting, just talking, just remembering, but somewhere along the way, just stopped being enough. There was a shift, a softness in the way he typed my name, the way he remembered the songs I used to love, the way he asked how I was, really was, and then waited for the truth. One rainy evening, we met again, a quiet wine bar tucked away from the noise of the city. I don't remember what we drank. I just remember the way his eyes lingered when I laughed, the way my body leaned in without asking permission. He told me he still thought about that summer we spent in Italy, the night we got lost in Florence, how we danced barefoot in a piazza with no music. I hadn't thought about that in years, but suddenly the memory came rushing back, hot pavement underfoot, the smell of wine and street roses, the feeling of being completely known. You were different then, he said quietly. So were you, I whispered. When I got home that night, Nathan was already asleep again. The lights were off. The house was still. I stood in the hallway, holding my breath, heart pounding in my chest like I'd done something wrong, though nothing had happened. Not really. But the guilt was there. That's how I knew it had begun. From then on, I started living two lives. By day, I went through the motions. Emails, meetings, dinner, silence. I laughed when I needed to, nodded when expected. Nathan didn't notice anything different. Or maybe he did, and just didn't want to ask. By night, I drifted toward Julian like a tide drawn by something ancient and inevitable. We never touched, not once. But the way he looked at me felt more intimate than anything I'd felt in years. One evening, after a long walk by the river, he brushed a strand of hair behind my ear and said, You still tilt your head when you're trying not to cry. You used to do that when we argued, remember? I did. And I realized he remembered things about me that I had forgotten, things Nathan never even knew. That night, I lay next to my husband in the dark and I cried, quietly, so he wouldn't wake. Because I wasn't sure who I was betraying more, him or myself. It was a Wednesday, gray skies, thick with snow that hadn't yet fallen. I had canceled a meeting that morning, something about a vendor delay, but really, I just needed to breathe. Needed silence. Or maybe I needed him. Julian texted around noon. Studio's quiet today. Drop by if you need a place to hide. I didn't even hesitate. His studio was a converted warehouse on the west side. Cold concrete floors, tools scattered in organized chaos. When I walked in, he was working on a new piece, his hands streaked with clay. He looked up, smiled softly, and just said, "Hey," like I came there every day, like I belonged. We talked for a while about art, about the way winter always made him restless, about nothing important, and everything that was. Then came the silence. Not the awkward kind, the kind that feels heavy with choice. I was sitting on the edge of a work table, fingers tracing the rim of a coffee mug. He stepped closer, just a breath away, close enough to feel the warmth of his body against the cold air. "Claire," he said quietly, like a secret. I looked up, and in that moment, I wanted him to kiss me. I wanted it so badly, it terrified me. But he didn't. He just looked at me, and I looked back. And in that pause, I felt the full weight of everything I was about to lose. "I can't," I whispered, pulling away, not from him, but from myself. "I can't be this person." Julian didn't move. He didn't plead. He just nodded once, like he'd known all along. "You already are," he said gently. "But maybe it's not about being her. Maybe it's about being honest about why." That night, I came home to find Nathan sitting at the kitchen table, still in his work clothes, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him. He looked up when I walked in. There was something in his eyes, something not quite anger, not quite pain, just knowing. "Where were you?" he asked. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. "I found one of your emails," he said, voice low. "Not all of it, just enough." Silence. "I didn't sleep with him," I said finally. Nathan nodded slowly, as if that didn't matter. And I knew then that it didn't. Because I had loved someone else. Because I had gone somewhere else in my heart and left him behind. And in that kitchen full of unspoken things, we both felt something splinter quietly between us. Something that didn't make a sound, but would never quite fit back together again. In the days that followed, burnout, we didn't talk much. Nathan moved through the apartment like a ghost. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse me. He just stopped looking at me the way he used to. Like he'd turned a key somewhere inside himself and quietly locked me out. I kept waiting for a confrontation, for some explosion of pain or rage, but it never came. Instead, it was this suffocating quiet, the kind that settles into the walls, into the sheets, into the spaces between footsteps. We shared a bed, but not sleep. We shared meals, but not words. And Julian, he pulled away too, not out of punishment, but out of respect. Or maybe regret. After that day in his studio, he didn't reach out. No texts, no emails, just silence, soft and final. I think he knew I wasn't strong enough to let go on my own, so he did it for me. A week later, I went to his studio again, just once, just to see. It was empty, gone, as if he had never been there at all. That night, I stood in the hallway of our apartment, staring at the framed wedding photo on the console table. We looked so young, so certain. I traced my thumb along the edge of the glass, and for a moment, I couldn't recognize the woman in the picture. What had I done? Not just to Nathan, not just to Julian, but to myself. I had reached back for a version of love that no longer fit the shape of my life. I had tried to fill an absence without understanding it. And in doing so, I had created a new kind of emptiness, one I couldn't undo. The worst part wasn't losing Nathan or missing Julian. The worst part was realizing I had betrayed the quietest parts of myself, the parts that still believed in loyalty, in truth, in choosing what's right, even when it's hard. By the end of that month, Nathan asked for space. I packed a small bag and moved into a short term rental downtown. He didn't stop me, and I didn't ask him to. No yelling, no drama, just two people letting go of something that had already slipped through their fingers long before anyone said goodbye. It's been 3 months. The apartment I'm renting is small. Just one bedroom, a sliver of kitchen, and a window that looks out onto a quiet alley where no one ever seems to pass. There's a coffee shop down the street where I go most mornings, headphones in, pretending I'm writing something important, but mostly just watching the way people touch each other. A brush of fingers, a shared laugh, a warmth I used to know. Nathan and I speak sometimes, short, civil messages, details about bills, mail, furniture, the language of two people trying to unmake a life without making a mess. We haven't said the word divorce yet, but it's there, like a low hum in the background. I can feel it waiting. Julian never came back. I don't blame him. He was never meant to stay. He was a mirror, a beautiful, dangerous mirror reflecting the parts of me I had buried too deep for Nathan to ever reach. And I, foolishly, mistook the reflection for something real. People always say cheating is about sex, but it's not. At least it wasn't for me. It was about feeling alive. It was about someone remembering who I was before I became someone else's wife, before the silence, before the comfort turned cold. But in chasing that feeling, I crossed a line I can't uncross. I didn't just hurt Nathan. I didn't just lose Julian. I lost the version of myself I trusted. And now, here I am, 34, alone, with nothing but time and silence to answer to. Would I do it differently? Yes and no. Because maybe I needed to break something to realize how fragile it really was. Maybe I needed to get lost to understand where home was, or that sometimes home is just a person you used to be. I'm not sure if I believe in love the way I used to, but I believe in truth, and this is mine. Mel?